was really teaching about aging, although it doesn't translate that way. When the Buddha said, everything changes, everything passes away, everything is ephemeral, he might as well have been saying everything ages. That's nice, but what really is important is that you age and are aging, and particularly in this time of COVID, the fact that we are all getting older and vulnerable and more fragile is actually, we're living the teaching of the Buddha. Just to know that we are in the process of passing on, and someday, hopefully not soon, we will be gone. And that's what the Buddha basically started his teaching with, to know that and to know what to do about it so you can live a wholesome and satisfying life. I want to introduce the phrase, Dharma is reality. I heard a young Lama say this. For some reason, it struck me as quite profound, even though it's very simple. What he's basically saying is what the Buddha is teaching is reality itself, what is true, whether you believe in it or not. And aging is reality in the same way. You age whether you notice it or not, whether you believe in it or not, whether you care about it or not, aging is going on. And aging is profoundly about time. And we'll be talking more about time. The contemplative exercise I have for you today is about time, about different kinds of time, and about the way in which meditation practice can transform time. But one way to look at aging and being older is that we start to get a sense that time is running out. The hourglass is more gone than not. And that's something that can cause a great deal of distress. So, and particularly in the current day with COVID, COVID is like a fantastic, I wouldn't say fantastic, it's horrific, but it is a teaching. It's united everybody on the planet around the truth of evanescence, of impermanence. We can't live our life in blissful ignorance that we may not die. Even young people get COVID and die. And this class was recorded last year before there was a vaccine. So there was very much a sense of COVID being overwhelming to everyone. The first section of the class is called Aging is Reality. And I discuss all these topics in much more detail. And the contemplative practice that I offer in that session is called Aging Breath by Breath. Aging Breath by Breath. You may not realize it, but your body is a clock. It measures time. And those of you who have a meditation practice and who do in fact follow your breathing or count your breaths or are aware of breathing are actually immersed in the awareness of time. When you talk to people, older people, about time, some of them say time seems to be going faster, the days just blend in. Some people say that time is going more slowly. That's true, particularly if they have an illness. But in fact, the actual pace of human time is breath by breath. Picture a grandfather clock swinging its pendulum slowly from side to side. That's your breath. My teacher, Suzuki Roshi, used to characterize the breath as like a swinging door. And it's very similar to the grandfather clock. So tuning in to the breath with an awareness that it's a way to feel and discover the reality of aging is very valuable and very profound. And using the breath in this way is a real treasure. So aging breath by breath, I teach that in the first class. The second class is, I call Stages of Aging. And incidentally, many of these topics and practices are in my book, Aging as a Spiritual Practice, but not all of them. The class is based on the book, but the book has things that aren't in the class, and the class has things that aren't in the book, such as COVID and other new teachings that I've discovered. Stages of aging are, I identify 4. I won't go through all 4 in the time today, but I want to talk about the first one, which I call lightning strikes. Lightning strikes. In a minute, I'll tell you about my own experience of lightning strikes. But what I mean by that is there's some moment or crisis or point in your life where the truth, the reality of aging hits you like a bolt of lightning. I had one student, a woman in her early 40s, who met me in the supermarket. Her face was pale, and she said, "Lou, I don't know what to do. My mother just dropped dead of a heart attack." So for her, that was lightning strikes. And in my case, I had cancer when I was in my mid-30s. The doctor told me in his office that I had a life-threatening cancer, and they do their best. Well, you can see me today, nearly 40 years later, and you know how that turned out. But at the time, it was an incredible bolt of lightning. I had a 9-year-old son, a family. I was just starting my career out in the world after 12 years as a monk, and I had to deal with cancer. Lightning can strike in all kinds of ways, and that is, I consider, the first stage of aging. Sometimes that moment comes more than once. Sometimes we're all slow learners and we need to get hit more than once, but sooner or later, lightning strikes in a way that is incontrovertible, unavoidable, and your life changes, and you are now a person who is living in the world of aging. Another way that lightning strikes, if you're an older person, is when your friends start to die and you go to funerals. It's very sobering. When I was a boy, I used to notice, I was a sensitive boy, that older people like my grandfather seemed sober, even solemn. And now I know why. It's because your friends start to die. And each time it's a little lightning strike. So the contemplative practice I offer in the class for the 4 stages of aging is a practice I call vertical time, which we're going to do today a little bit. It's a more extended practice, but it's a way of acknowledging that on the one hand, aging is kind of shocking and sobering, but on the other hand, there is a way to move outside of that sequential, or what I call horizontal time world. Most of the time we live in horizontal time. When we say we're growing older, when I say I'm 74, the minute I say it, I have a picture of all my life, all my memories up to that point, and I have a kind of idea or speculation about what's in store in the future. That's horizontal time. There is another kind of time, which is, in a strict sense, timeless, which doesn't get involved in past, present, and future. So we'll come back to that when we do vertical time. Just very briefly, the other 3 stages of aging are coming to terms with aging, that's stage 2, adapting to aging, that's stage 3, and appreciation or acceptance of aging, that's stage 4. I have a wonderful story in my book about a 106-year-old woman I interviewed to illustrate what appreciation or acceptance of aging can be. She was somebody who started to learn to be a potter when she was 90 and became a master potter by the time she was 100. And not a potter, a weaver, I'm sorry. There was another person who was a potter. She was a beautiful weaver. And she took me around her house and showed me all of her weavings. This is a 106-year-old woman. Can you imagine the level of living with and learning to appreciate aging? Anyway, you can read about her more, and I talk about her a bit in the class. So I mentioned COVID. COVID is part of the reality that the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught the truth of sickness, old age, and death. This is how it's usually translated. I don't like those kinds of translations. Those are left over from scholars translating Pali or Sanskrit. All it really means is that if you have a body, you will sooner or later become ill. Can't avoid it. Back when I had cancer, this was 35 years ago, cancer frightens people. So they would always say, partly to deal with their own anxiety, they would say, well, do they know what caused it? Because, the minute you tell them you have cancer, they think, oh, maybe I'll get cancer. What caused it? But being a Buddhist, I gave the Buddhist answer, which is, it's because I have a body. If you don't want a body, arrange not to be born. But of course, for all of us, it's too late. We are born. And because we are born, we have a body. Because we have a body which works miraculously with very little attention from us. Eventually, a part of aging is that things will start to go wrong. Or in our world, some deadly virus will enter our body and make us deathly ill. There is an obscure doctrine in Buddhism called the 5 Great Fears. This is from the Theravada tradition, and I brought it forward because they're really interesting. And the 3rd section of the class is about the 5 Great Fears. Now, keep in mind, these doctrines were developed by monks, celibate monks, yet they had fears. Very briefly, the 5 fears are fear of illness, of course, fear of death, even monks have that. Fear of losing your mental faculties. Well, we know what that means. And many older people I talk to say, Lou, there's only one thing I'm really afraid of, and that's dementia. That's fear of losing your mental faculties. The 4th one is really interesting, fear of loss of livelihood. Now, how did monks come up with that? In ancient India, their livelihood was mendicancy. They went around the villages with their begging bowls. That was their livelihood. But they were totally dependent on whether the peasants had enough extra food to put in there. If they didn't, they could starve. And of course, every time they went, they were worried they wouldn't get to eat anything. And these days, fear of loss of livelihood is very real. There's a lot of economic turmoil as an aftermath of COVID. One of the big fears that older people have is they'll outlive their money. They don't have enough money, or if they've lost money, they can't sleep at night. They wake up in a cold sweat. So in the class, I don't want to do all 5. There isn't time. So I did fear of illness and fear of loss of livelihood, because I think those are things that most people today can really identify with. I'm moving rather fast here, but I only have a certain amount of time to summarize the class. If you want to get into more detail, then by all means take the class or read my book. But I as the contemplative part of the class, I introduce a calming meditation, visualization from the Tibetan tradition called Calm Lake. Calm Lake. In Tibet, in the high mountains, there's lots of little lakes, very quiet, pristine, no wind. And the monks actually went there to meditate. And that became in the Tibetan tradition, one of the 21 objects of calming meditation, or shamatha, which means to calm and focus the mind. And since the fears that we experience agitate the mind and make us upset, I felt that having a visualization which engages our senses, you visualize internally a calm lake as though you're sitting in the mountains in front of one, and imagine storms coming up representing your agitated mind, and then managing those storms, all of that. People like this practice. I like it. I learned it when I studied Tibetan Buddhism, and it's very effective. It's very effective. So moving on to the fourth class, it's important when you talk about aging, not to have it all be downer stuff like illness and fears and everything. Class 4 is about gratitude. Gratitude is and can be an important feature and compensatory feature of aging. Older people actually, they have a lot to feel regretful for. They wish things had gone differently. But on the other hand, older people have a lot to be grateful for. Most fundamentally, older people are glad to be alive, particularly if, like me, you've had some very, very serious illnesses that they told you would die from. I've had 2 of those. So every time I wake up, I think, well, I'm still here. There's a book by Ram Dass, who had a stroke in his latter years, called Still Here. And being still here is wonderful. And I also find for myself and many people I talk to who are older, that when you're older, there's a kind of aesthetic joy. You have time to just enjoy nature and light and shadow and food and nourishment and children and dogs. So many things that when you're busy trying to make a career and do this or that, you don't really have that. It's not just the time, it's that when you're older, you really appreciate the wonder of these things, how extraordinary that in spite of all the terrible things that happen in the world, there are these moments of beauty. And the practice I give for this session is what I call the gratitude walk. This is something I developed on my own to make vivid these moments of appreciation and moments of gratitude as an older person. It's a pretty simple practice to describe. It's more subtle to do it, but I have people take a walk with the intention of just finding out how many things you can see and hear and smell and maybe even taste during your walk, for which you can feel gratitude. There's so many things: dogs, dogs are wonderful creatures. They're very uplifting. They come and look at you and want to be petted, and it's wonderful to just relate to them. And plants, fruits. I remember when I was recovering from my neurological illness, I was in a wheelchair, and my wife wheeled me out in the summertime to a blackberry bush near the rehab hospital. And just to, first of all, they told me I would die. I didn't, but I was damaged. And just to be able to reach up and taste a fresh blackberry off the bush was a real wonderful thing. So the gratitude walk is something you can do and make a regular part of your life. You can also do a gratitude walk in your house. You can do a gratitude walk in your town. There's lots of flavors of gratitude walk. My teacher, Suzuki Roshi, once said, he said strange things sometimes. He said, gratitude is this moment. You'd think maybe he didn't quite understand English, but I think he did. Gratitude is this moment. It's not that you can find gratitude in this moment, but this moment intrinsically, existentially is gratitude. That insight comes from a lifetime of sitting still and letting your mind and body rest in this moment, in the succession of moments. He also said, evanescence is the reason we enjoy life. Evanescence or change is the reason we enjoy life. That's the opposite of what you might think. Evanescence is perhaps a reason to fear life or be sad about things that you're losing. But no, he says evanescence is the reason we enjoy life. So these are just some tidbits of this unit. I go into a lot more detail about gratitude and the various ways it's part of our life. So moving on to the fifth class, I call it elderhood. Elderhood is, I wish there was more being written and spoken about elderhood. Elderhood is actually not a very commonly used term. We have childhood, we have adulthood. We don't exactly have teenhood, but we all know what that means, being a teenager. Elderhood means the state of being, not just being old, but being an elder. Elder and older are different. An elder implies some kind of sageness or wisdom, or the ability to pass on what you have learned in life. And the one thing that all elders have, the young people do not have, is the experience of having lived a whole life. This is actually very important, and the latest research in aging is showing that there are many ways in which aging people aren't as good as younger people. Our reflexes are slower, our memory is slower, and so forth. But older people are quite a bit better than younger people at recognizing patterns in things and in people, in making decisions, in understanding connections. Why? Because we've been doing it longer. That's what life is. Each day, each month, each year, you have to contend with what life brings you. And older people have been doing it for longer. And keep in mind that in every pre-industrial traditional community on the planet, the elders were the repository of important knowledge and wisdom. Today, younger people, even me, imagine, well, I'll Google it. I'll Google it. Well, you can get knowledge on Google, more than you might want, but you can't get wisdom. Google doesn't know anything. It just has facts. Wisdom requires a lifetime of experience, and that's what elderhood means. And all the research shows that the best way to overcome the negative aspects of aging is to find something, some way to contribute what you know and what you have learned, even if it just means spending time, or in this case, FaceTime with your grandchildren, volunteering in some way, doing something to express your generosity, helping a neighbor. Human beings are naturally evolved to be in communities and to help each other. And it's quite unnatural and quite unhealthy to sequester or push off to the side older people in care homes and senior living facilities where they can't engage with all generations. This is, again, very, very recent. Until quite recently, all families were multi-generational, and you didn't have to look very far with your grandparents. They lived in the house, and they showed you things, and they told you things. In my latest book, which is specifically geared toward men, I talk about finding the inner grandfather. The grandfather or grandmother are very, very important to the wholesome development of a mature adult. And this is a way that you can give back and offer something to younger people. The contemplative practice, again, I offer from the Tibetan tradition, is called sending and receiving. Tonglen, for those of you who are familiar with the term. It's a simplified version of it, but basically it's a way of visualizing or internalizing, sending, we might say in the parlance when I was growing up, good vibes or good feelings to someone who might need your help, to someone who is ill, to someone who is young, to someone who is needy, and to take in and absorb and be aware of their difficulty, their suffering, as a kind of circle of giving and receiving. Very powerful practice, and I learned it from one of my Tibetan Buddhist teachers, and it's stood me in good stead in this arena of finding ways to express your elderhood. So elderhood is something that needs to be developed in our postmodern society. We need to, as older people, work against the grain. Advertisers run the world, run the consumer world, and their target for advertising is 18 to 55-year-old. The only people that get advertised over 55 are on the network news, where they advertise, nostrums for older people, aspirin and stuff. We need to turn that around. The society needs to once again look to its elders. There's probably never been a time in human history when we needed wisdom more than now. So we're winding up. The sixth class is what I call sacred presence, sacred presence. And sacred presence, another way to, the core practice that I learned from my teacher, Suzuki Roshi, and which I discovered is also a core practice in Tibetan Buddhism, is what we might call in English resting in awareness or resting in reality. This is a little different than following your breath or focusing on the calm lake or any of that. Those are practices to focus the mind. This practice is much more fundamental. It's a practice to rest the mind in its essence, which is, the essence of mind is boundless. In Buddhism, they like to say empty, but Empty doesn't have quite the right feeling in English, in my view. Empty or emptiness sounds like there's something lacking. I like boundless because boundless is very expansive. And actually, your own conscious mind has no boundary. It's limitless. And resting in that sacred awareness or sacred presence is the deepest treasure of Buddha Dharma. And so I didn't feel the course would be complete unless I taught that, because that's the core practice that's been transmitted to me. And because I lived and worked with my teacher, Suzuki Roshi, I saw the effect of a lifetime of that practice in a fully developed human being who radiated love. That's all I can say. Anyone who knew my teacher, Suzuki Roshi, knew that when he looked at you, you knew that he loved you and that he accepted you for who you were, and everything was okay. And one look could do it. I've talked to people who only met Suzuki Roshi once. They looked at him once on a bridge or on a path, and it changed their life. So this is the real deep treasure of the Buddha. And I wanted to end the class with that in mind. So what I've given you is, a whirlwind tour of a 6-week class. Each unit's an hour and a half. So there's a lot of material, a lot of detail, and a lot of stories and anecdotes from my own life of practice and people that I've spoken to. So I think you'll find that these topics are very rich and nourishing for you. So we have 10 minutes now before we're going to open it up for questions. I see there's almost 700 of you out there, so there's going to be a few questions among many that Carolyn will pick out. Not time for a lot of people's questions, but until then, I wanted to go back to this practice I call vertical time. Now, typically, to really do a full session of vertical time, I need about 20 minutes or 25 minutes. We've got 10, so bear with me. I'm just going to outline the practice, not really do it for you, but I'll give you the bare bones of it, and you can read about it in my book, or if you take the class, learn about it. Imagine that you're sitting by the side of a country road, looking crossways across the road. And to the left, the road stretches off into the distance, and to the right, it stretches off into the distance. You could be sitting in meditation posture if you're imagining that, if you're a meditator, or just sitting in a chair, it's okay. But just picture that in your mind. And then imagine that this road that stretches to the left and to the right is a map of your life, or a map of time as you've experienced it in your life. To the left is the past, to the right is the future, and where you are right now is the present. Now, all of us have a map like that in our heads. We do. It's how we organize time. To the left is memory. To the right is speculation or anticipation. So the left-hand side of the road has, you might say, it's memory. It's not actually reality. We remember things, and we tend to remember important things in our life. So imagine that there are road signs stretching off into the distance. The near road signs are important things that happened to you recently. Maybe you retired. maybe your son or daughter got a new job, maybe your grandchildren graduated from high school, and so forth. And you go further back, and then there may be a sign that says, I retired from my career, or you maybe had an illness that you recovered from. You know, each person's life has these markers. You can think of them as markers. And if you go further back, it becomes fainter and fainter. Our memory is not so detailed, but at some point back there, we were children. We remember some high points of being a child. And around the bend where you can't see or remember, there was, in every case, for every human being who ever lived, the day you were born, birth. Oftentimes in my Zen tradition, they speak of birth and death. Birth and death are the boundaries of a life. And so back there in the distant past, there was birth. You don't remember it, but it was the most important event of your life and everyone's life. So we can go into a lot more detail about how to consider or use this map of the past. But for now, let's move on and turn your attention to the right side of the road. Now, this is different because these are things that have not yet happened. They may or may not happen, but they are things that you're thinking about and that you are planning for and that you're anticipating. And the further out you go, the foggier it gets. In the near part of the road, right close to where you are, there are what you're going to be doing next week, next month. There are good things. You may be, now that we have a vaccine and you can move around, you may be getting on an airplane and visiting relatives you haven't seen in person in a long time. You may be planning some celebration, going to a restaurant, and so forth. As it goes further out, given the fact that we're older, I'm 74, and you start to bargain with reality, and you think, well, could I get to 80? I think, yeah, I think I can get to 80. I've had some serious hits to my health, but I'm pretty healthy now. Yeah, I'll get to 80. 85. Well, I know some of my neighbors who are 85. Some of them look good. The woman across the street looks great. Some of them are pretty frail. I'd feel, that's 11 years from now, I'd feel really good if I could get to 85. But I want to be healthy. And will I still be able to get around? Will my knees work? Will I have a chronic degenerative illness? Older people actually spend a lot of time either consciously or unconsciously thinking about these things. So these are, you might say there are markers in the future, but they're very hazy, and they get hazier and hazier. What's really the important marker is one that you can't even see, no one can see, but you think about a lot, and that is the moment of your death. We know it's out there. We hope that it's a ways off. We're bargaining with reality or God or Buddha to give us more time. But inevitably, for every life form, this is part of what the Buddha taught, you vanish, you pass away. Everything that you've ever known and loved, including your precious self, will eventually be gone. Perhaps a sad, depressing thought, perhaps not, but definitely it's worth becoming conscious of the fact that it's out there, and at least at an unconscious level or in your dreams, it's a factor that you think about. So now, having mapped out the past and the future, let's pay attention to you sitting in the road with your back straight, and start to pay attention, as you can do right now as you're listening to me, to your breathing. Up and down, in and out. You know, there's a sense when you meditate, you feel that your breath rises from your stomach and then falls. This is what I call vertical time. It's very different than the horizontal time we've been talking about. Vertical time is not really in time. There's no past or future to it. Every breath is always in the same place. You don't have, when you're a young child, have child's breaths, and then as you get older, you have adults' breaths, and then older people's breaths. Every breath is just like every other, and it all happens in exactly the same way, in exactly the same place. This is actually, I call it vertical time because it liberates you from the limitations that you feel as an older person with the road of the past and the road of the future. Breath is actually timeless. And every moment of your life, you actually are resting. And this goes back to sacred presence or resting in awareness. You're actually resting in this timeless moment, which doesn't age. It doesn't grow older. It doesn't wear out, not till the very end, and you take your last breath. And my teacher, Suzuki Roshi, was once asked, what happens when you die? A question we all have. He said, and he's not the only Buddhist teacher who said this, he said, nothing happens. Well, we laughed, you know, what does he mean? Nothing happens. Of course, something happens, you die. That's a pretty big deal. But the last exhale of your life in vertical time is no different than every other exhale you've ever had. And both he and the Buddha and every Buddhist teacher explain that every time you breathe out or expire, an English word which means breathe out and it also means to die, every time you expire, you're rehearsing. Not rehearsing, you're enacting the last breath. And if you treat your breath that way, and if you realize the treasure of always being aware of vertical time, which goes nowhere, has no past or future, the concern, the fear of death, the sense of it being unknown, the sense of it being a black cloud out there in the future, it's just another breathing out, that's all. And with that, I'll close this very brief introduction into the practice of vertical time. You can read about it in my book, or if you take the class, it will be, actually vertical time is at the end of class 2. And you can practice it on a regular basis until you build an awareness of the different kinds of time. So thanks for your patience in listening to this rather roller coaster rapid rendition and preview of a much longer class. I'm going to turn things back over to Carolyn. I have intentionally not been looking at all the questions popping up on the screen because I go crazy trying to read them, but she read them. And she's going to bring out some questions for me in the last 15 minutes here that I can respond to, and I'll try to keep my answers brief.
Well, thank you so much, Lewis, for that practice and for your talk. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so I know, people are excited to hear from you more about these topics. So we'll start with a question, something a little broader. Do you have any tips for someone facing intense fear of the suffering that may come from disease?
Come from what?
From disease.
I didn't catch it. I didn't catch the last part.
Do you have any tips for someone who is afraid of the intense suffering that may come from disease?
Oh, from disease. Well, I've had some pretty horrible diseases in my life, and there was a lot of suffering. So this is not theoretical for me. I've been there. I'll just quote briefly something that a psychiatrist, psychotherapist said to me when I asked him about suffering and how he answers patients who had that kind of question. And he said, you know, and he was an older man at that time, in my long experience, what I've observed is that most of the time things work out. Now, you can think of a lot of counterexamples where they didn't work out and people were in intense pain forever, but he's not saying that it always works out, but a lot more times than you think in your own situation, things work out or change in a way that you're not expecting. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We have another question about resistance versus acceptance as we engage with aging. Could you speak to those concepts a little bit? How that plays a role in aging gracefully?
They're both there. Everybody, including me, would like to be younger. You know, they say youth is wasted on the young. They don't realize how wonderful it is when you have it. That's the resistance part. I think I wrote the whole book that could be a way of describing the book, from resistance to acceptance. Of course, there's resistance. That's part of what aging is. But I do feel that Buddhist teaching gives you resources to find your way through it and find some acceptance, like the 106-year-old woman. I won't even go into all the bad things that happened to her along life, but she found eventually acceptance. I would say that acceptance doesn't come quickly or easily, but it does come.
Thanks for addressing that. Another question, someone is asking about aging parents and how they can continue to embrace exploration and change in their old age. Grant is saying that his parents are in good health and they have plenty of time, but they're hesitant to try new things for fear of making the wrong decision and disrupting their comfort, which I think is probably something that a lot of people can relate to with their parents or with themselves.
Well, I have a great riposte to that. In the New York Times today, some of you read it, there's a story about the mother of Alex Hanold. Do you know who he is? He climbed El Capitan without any ropes. His mother, who's 70, decided on her 70th birthday that she was going to climb El Capitan. And she did. Now, she had ropes. Let's not be silly, but and you read the article and, you know, maybe he inherited something from her because she's just tremendously courageous. But do you all know what I mean about climbing El Capitan in Yosemite without ropes? It's a 3,000-foot cliff. He's the only man who ever did it. And his mother is no slouch. She found a way to challenge herself and to break new ground. And she's just an ordinary older woman, and she was able to do it. So if she can do it, we can do it. As far as convincing your parents to do it, that's a whole other cup of tea. I'm not going to go there because it's hard to talk to your parents. But I'll just leave you with that story. It was pretty inspiring, actually.
I love that story. Very inspiring. Another participant is asking if you can speak a bit more to dementia and the fear of dementia.
This is a tough one. The man who told me that's the one thing he feared was a eminent psychiatrist, you know, a mental health professional who knew all the ins and outs of dementia. It's terrifying. If you've spent your life accomplishing things with your mind in particular, It's just terrifying. Now, they say that in true Alzheimer's, as you go into Alzheimer's, you don't really experience the terror of it. You think you're okay, but you just can't do anything. That doesn't really help when you're in fear of it. I do remember that there was a Tibetan Lama named Trungpa Rinpoche who, in one of his books of lectures, was asked by a student, what about dementia? When all your faculties go, how can you practice? How can you be a whole person? And his response, which you may or may not find helpful, is, yes, the faculties go, but the essence of the person does not go anywhere. And this speaks to sacred presence, the last practice in the last class. It isn't very much comfort, actually, if you're afraid of it, but let's put it this way. If you don't actually have dementia right now, it's not terribly helpful to be afraid of it, even though it's hard to put that fear aside. Try to concentrate on the things you have today. Gratitude. You know, today I'm not demented. When you have a parent or a loved one who is demented, and I've had two relatives or my wife's relatives, it's very, very hard to see someone disappear that way. But let's put it this way, it's just like my cancer. The reason people have dementia is because they're living so much longer than they ever did. People in the old days died when they were 35. Nobody had dementia. So dementia is part of the gift of longevity. That's one way to look at it.
Another question from Eleanor, who is asking, how do you address the idea that aging is a failure?
Failure of what? What would success look like? Escapes it. I think that thought needs to be closely examined, because birth implies aging. You age actually from the moment you're conceived, you're aging. Children age, but they like growing older. You know, kids want to be, if you ask a kid how old he is, he'll say, I'm 5 3/4. You know, they just can't wait to be 6. They want to be 6 and they want to be grown up. So there is a part of your life where aging is a big success, you know, to be able to drive and go out and have a drink and have your own life. So I think that's a good, I think maybe we all feel that way sometimes, but I think it's a very good corrective to say, no, it's not. It's just, you remember the book Tuesdays with Morrie? That was a huge bestseller about a man who had a terrible disease. And he said, you know, don't feel sorry for me. Don't worry about me. I'm just paying back the gift of life. I mean, he of all people, he had Huntington's disease. He was slowly becoming paralyzed. And he said, don't worry. I'm just paying back the gift of life. I think that's the way to look at it.
That's a beautiful reminder. Another question coming in is about what we can do now to prepare for a conscious dying process.
Well, I'm good friends with Frank Ostaseski, who was one of the founders of the hospice movement. And one of the things he told me, he's attended thousands of deaths. And he said, Lou, one thing you got to realize is death never goes the way you think. It goes the way it goes. Sometimes you have a quiet, pain-free, slow exit into the great space of being. Sometimes you're in terrible pain. Sometimes you're in terrible fear. I think what's more, and he said, and people feel that if their death is not wonderful, that somehow they failed or they haven't done it right. I think I think it's enough to just be conscious of the fact that death will come and be ready when it does. It could come tomorrow. It could come in the next moment. Men in particular often just drop dead right in front of their wives of a heart attack at a young age. You never know. So I think what's more important is to open your mind to the fact that death is just the other side of the coin of life, you know, heads and tails. You can't have a coin with just heads. It's got to have, or a hand with just the front. It's got to have both sides. And if you lift your hand and say, life, death, it's all one hand, then that's enough preparation, I think.
Someone is asking about your own personal experience with neurological disease, which you wrote about in one of your books. Did that eliminate your fear of death? Is what's being asked.
Well, we're almost out of time, so I will just give a very short answer. Yes, it did. But I was in a very unusual state of mind. I was in a coma for 2 weeks, but I was awake and aware inside the coma the whole time. And I had hundreds of visions and very unusual experiences. And I actually knew that I was close to death, which medically I was. And I had no fear, and I was very comfortable with it. And I came out of that experience and slowly got better, realizing that, you know, we all know how to die. All creatures know how to die. We know how to die. And there's nothing to be afraid of. Your body knows what it needs to know to die. Just trust it.
I think we'll leave it on that note. Thank you so much, Lou, for joining us today. Thank you for everyone who participated and shared their questions. We'll put links in the chat again for Lewis Richmond's book, Aging as a Spiritual Practice, for his tricycle online course, also Aging as a Spiritual Practice. And we have a special $20 off discount code. And we'll also put in a link if you'd like to donate to Tricycle to support these and other free offerings. It's tricycle.org/donate. Thank you again.
Well, I see a lot of thank yous coming in on the screen. So thank you back. Thank you all for listening and being patient. And I appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, goodbye, everyone.